Before I start, thank you everybody for attending. I know we're getting later in the day, but hopefully this will spur an interesting conversation. Being the cannabis guys, we want this to happen organically, so we won't wait till the end. If there's questions while we're speaking or any particular topics that you want to know more about, please raise your hand. I'm sure there's someone around from AAIS that can hand you the microphone. So I'll let Rich. So Rich Goals, I've known him for several years. One of the top folks in the cannabis industry. I knew him from Aon, where he was running the cannabis practice. He's recently made a transition. I'm going to kind of let him walk you through his background, where he's at now, so they'll give you some context from an experience standpoint.
Yeah, appreciate it, Joe, and thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it, AAIS. It's an awesome event, awesome venue, and excited to do it, so thank you very much. So like Joe said, my name is Rich Goals. I'm with Symphony Grow. As Joe stated, I had previously started the cannabis practice at Aon a few years back when they decided they wanted to enter the space. It was wonderful. I had spent about 5 years prior to that at Aon in a consulting group and have nothing but great things to say about them. I joined Symphony Grow about a year ago, October 12th, 2021. It was started by TJ Frost, who had started the Hub International Cannabis practice back in, I think, 2014. And grew that to the largest cannabis practice in the U.S. And I think we both had really similar experiences at larger firms like that. The cannabis business is just so unique. The buyers are a different type of person typically. The exposures are very different. The carriers are all very different. And while those companies have just fantastic resources, they're not necessarily the resources that a cannabis business needs. So Symphony Grow was built specifically to address everything A to Z cannabis, insurance, risk management, and then a huge variety of partners on top of that, everything from CPAs, attorneys, 401ks, A to Z. So
I guess where we'll start, we'll use the word, market trends, which is kind of an umbrella term. There's a lot of things trending in the cannabis industry right now. Maybe top of mind, at least for me, Rich, you might have a different opinion, but the political landscape, which is continually shifting. I think a few years ago there was a lot of optimism around the cannabis industry, cannabis potentially becoming legalized or moving in that direction. And we just recently saw Biden make a declaration with respect to low-level cannabis, marijuana, criminal arrests. So any thoughts on that? Is that lip service? Is that going to substantiate any significant change? What are your feelings on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, the federal landscape is probably the biggest thing shaping what the cannabis insurance business looks like, and I mean the cannabis business at all. The fact that it's still federally legal means that most of the traditional admitted carriers just won't touch it. It's all excess and surplus. It's very, very limited. 20-page applications that are all warrants on the policies. What I would say is, I think. Speaking about business, I don't know that this is much more than lip service. I mean, we're still sitting on the Safe Banking Act that has been proposed for, 5 years now, that would basically just allow financial institutions to work with cannabis businesses, and that continues to not pass. So I don't necessarily see, federal decriminalization of low-level cannabis charges as an indicator that the federal government is going to move towards legalization and kind of recognize the industry. Is it a step in the right direction? Absolutely. I think it's going to make a big difference in a lot of people's lives, and it continues to build that cultural momentum. Does this mean it's going to become federally legal anytime soon? I have my doubts.
So mentioning the Safe Banking Act, I think there's a misperception that financial institutions will not facilitate transaction amongst operators, insurers, but there is a contingency of financial institutions. Is it primarily credit unions? I mean, who are some of the players that are that are facilitating these monetary transactions with the operators.
Yeah, you nailed it. A lot of credit unions, typically, anything federally chartered or with strong federal relationships, they're typically not participating. The credit unions have really stepped up in their respective states. You can go to many dispensaries now, and through a combination of a credit union and kind of a third-party payment processor, you can actually use a credit card sometimes. Is that more of a gray area than a temporary solution? Yes. Businesses can get around it. There are ways they can do these transactions, but it is still very much cash heavy, especially at the point of sale. And I don't see that changing at a broad scale until we get, kind of more of the, larger regional and national financial institutions playing.
And I think there's, another misperception is we're talking about the legal and federal landscape, that the FBI or SWAT team is going to, swoop into a CEO of an insurance company that's underwriting the cannabis exposure. But to my knowledge and what I've researched, there has not been one arrest by any federal agency for any legitimate transactions within the insurance industry. But I think that is a stigma, or that is a notion that a lot of carriers or executives have, that they're going to be facing major jail time for writing a dispensary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that a fairly accurate statement? Maybe you're aware of someone that's...
No, I'm not aware of any enforcement against anyone in the insurance industry. Thank God, I'm sure I'm top of that list. But, so each year, the federal government essentially, in their budget, or every 2 years, or however often they do it, I'm not educated in politics, I apologize, they pass essentially a tentative agreement that no federal dollars are going to go towards enforcement of cannabis businesses that are legally compliant with their specific state. And I to date have not seen any federal enforcement against any licensed cannabis business. I think that really means it's unlikely that they're going to give any sort of enforcement to an insurance company or an insurance broker. But I think the concern is that, this is kind of a tentative agreement that's reached year to year. It's by no means a guarantee going into the future. And I think a lot of the large carriers still, rightfully view cannabis as a small opportunity compared to the rest of what they write, globally. And they view that enforcement risk as, as very real. Does that mean jail time? Probably not. Does it mean that there's a risk-reward calculation on a, small piece of premium versus a much larger, book of business in other industries? Absolutely. And I think that's what keeps a lot of these on the sidelines. A lot are starting to poke around through their excess and surplus divisions, things like that, but it's really on kind of a one-off basis. Very few admitted solutions still.
So I think that's a good lead-in to a capacity issue. I mean, it's traditionally been a very shallow pool of insurance carriers that are underwriting cannabis operators, even shallower of a pool for reinsurers. What is the capacity looking like these days? And we can kind of go through some of the lines. I know D&O has traditionally been a very difficult proposition for a variety of reasons. One, I think there's a stigma with business owners, cannabis operators, that there's a low level of business acumen, which couldn't be further from the truth. Sure, maybe there's a few folks out there that don't have the business acumen, but they've got the ability to grow a good product.
Sure.
But a lot of mergers and acquisitions, we're seeing that more and more within the industry. What does the D&O landscape look like now in terms of capacity and in terms of willing participants?
Yeah. Well, I think D&O is a great example of this market actually, developing and maturing quite a bit. 3 years ago, if you were a cannabis business and you wanted to go out and get D&O insurance, you were probably going to be paying $50,000 for $1 million limit at the minimum. If you were publicly traded, $250,000 and up. To the point where it doesn't actually, it doesn't make sense. You have to buy it, but is this an actual, worthwhile risk transfer? No. I would say D&O has matured more than any other line of business in the market. I think there have been 5 or 6 new programs that have come out in the last 18 months, call it. We're now seeing quotes for 15, 20,000 for $1 million, which is still hugely inflated compared to some other industries, but it really has developed quite a bit. And I think a reason for that is a lot more sophisticated capital has begun to enter the space. It used to be very, very few venture capital firms with specialty in cannabis. Now there are hundreds, and we're starting to see even in Illinois, for example, starting to see some major pension funds starting to look at investing into some of these businesses. Actually, kind of just starting to see that in the last couple of weeks. I'm curious about the implications there. But I think it has kind of been this rush of more sophisticated capital, investors joining boards and demanding that D&O be in place. And the market has really responded to that. At other lines, the story is not the same. Auto is still very distressed for cannabis businesses. Property has gotten better. It's still very challenging for large schedules. So it's different for each line. But D&O is an example of the market really recognizing a need and a lot of entrants bringing capacity.
So you mentioned auto. Is there a hesitancy from the carrier perspective? Is it the transportation across state lines? Obviously, there's states that are legal, but once you cross into a state that has not legalized cannabis, is that an issue, or is it? We've been hearing more, and I recently sat in a conference where a lot of insurers were objecting for the auto because of the DWI potential, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I have thoughts about it. I don't know if I have a hard answer for why auto has kind of been overlooked by the marketplace. One thing I would say is it's not the primary line that most of these businesses are buying. If you have a cultivation or a dispensary, you buy property, you buy products liability, workers' compensation, et cetera. Most states didn't have a sort of a transport function separate from those exposures, until pretty recently. So it's a smaller segment of the market. I think carriers look at it as less of an opportunity. I think it's also, it's fairly risky in terms of the theft that happens with transporting, large amounts of cash and cannabis in a vehicle. I would imagine that those are kind of the key drivers there on the commercial line side. DWI is a really interesting topic. It's always talked about in new states that are legalizing recreationally. People are always concerned about what does that look like on our roads? Is there going to be an increase in accidents? And so far from what I've been able to tell, the data is a little bit mixed. I know Colorado, I see studies pretty regularly that show there has not been an increase in fatal vehicle accidents. I believe I did see a study recently, I can't remember what state it was in, that had the opposite conclusion. I think the difficulty is that to date, there is still no test for intoxication or impairment with cannabis. You can get a breathalyzer for alcohol. It tells you at that moment in time, how much alcohol is in your system. Is that over the legal limit, yes or no? With cannabis, it simply doesn't work that way. You could have cannabis in your system at high levels and you haven't used it for a couple of weeks for some users. There are some, of course, that's a major area of innovation. There are a lot of people trying to create that technology. There are certain things like saliva tests, other field tests that I have heard of police departments rolling out. Whether or not those are going to hold up in court, I'm not positive. I haven't seen too many high-profile cases of that play out yet, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on, especially as consumption locations become more of a thing. Illinois, I think, has the first one down in Champaign. I think there's a second one somewhere now. Colorado has a couple. Nevada has a couple. They're still rare, but I think that'll become more and more of a concern as those start to be approved and start operating.
Consumption location being similar to like a hookah lounge or whatever, except you're
bar for weed. Yeah,
you're smoking marijuana, right? So obviously that poses a slew of challenges for insurers. But along those kind of new exposures you were talking. Oh, please.
The consumption locations, are they, again, I know there's not many that are they serving alcohol and allowing?
No, just cannabis. And that's actually a really, really difficult area in insurance, as you could imagine, is a consumption event with both alcohol and cannabis. You can imagine these, especially in the more mature states like California, businesses very much want to do that. They want to throw a party, they want to show off their product, serve refreshments as well, and that can be really, really difficult to get good coverage for.
So going back there, we talked about the auto, but one of the new exposures that I'm seeing, delivery services. Mm-hmm. There's a couple areas, states that are now allowing, just like Grubhub. Mm-hmm. It's something along the lines of I don't know, whatever clever name they have for delivering weed or whatever, but I certainly see that as an exposure with respect to auto, not necessarily the DWI, but the theft.
Sure.
I think.
And I think DWI as well for that exposure specifically. For kind of a dispensary. The way we split delivery is B2C or B2B. So B2C, you just like Uber Eats or whatever, you place an order, they come and drop it off at your house. I think DWI is an exposure there. I think a lot of people who work in that industry are cannabis users. I've seen dispensaries that actually give products out to their drivers, and it's not, hey, use this throughout the day, but it's here's a free sample. So it's things like that kind of create a culture that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when this was all illegal, people may not have thought about as much, but now you have serious liability, driving a car down the road and making deliveries, carrying cash and product. We also see a lot of turnover in that business, so a lot of EPLI claims, as I would imagine is the same for other kind of gig-based services or businesses. And typically the way dispensaries are doing this now is all hired and non-owned. So it's personal vehicles being used by personal employees or by employees, and I think you lose some of the quality control when that happens.
Yeah, I'd like to see a study users of marijuana for the delivery service as opposed to pizza delivery guys. I don't know if there's going to be much difference. But kind of going along those new exposures, we've talked about consumption, we've talked about DWIs. Where does cyber? I mean, obviously cyber is not a new exposure, but it is relatively new within the cannabis the cannabis marketplace. Can you talk a little bit about cyber?
Yeah. Well, especially as credit unions have become a little bit more participating a bit more in the marketplace, and businesses are beginning to sometimes take payment online. At the very least, if you place a dispensary order online, they're probably collecting your driver's license information, maybe your medical card information, and that creates exposure. I would say a lot of that is somewhat new in the last 2 to 4 years. Cannabis businesses before that simply weren't really selling these things online or listing their menus online, taking those orders to that extent, and I think that really opens them up. Similarly, kind of bridging the gap of liability and cyber, seeing a lot of claims related to telephone consumer protection, dispensaries sending you a lot of text messages about their sales, things like that. And these businesses they often don't have that sort of years and years of compliance background that's required to navigate those kind of murky waters. So we're seeing more and more of it, and I think it's going to skyrocket as soon as taking payments online becomes the norm.
Mm-hmm. So do you think theft is still the primary driver from the claims perspective? Is that is that number one, and then maybe cyber number two, or whatever however they fall? Is theft still the biggest issue within the industry.
Yeah, definitely. That people know that these businesses carry, a lot of money worth of product. Could be 300, 500,000, $1 million sitting in a, sometimes it's not even a safe or a vault room. Sometimes there's cash there. A few years ago, where you and I both used to live, Modern Cannabis in Logan Square, I don't think they ever caught the guy, but presumably it was a former employee, used their key card to get in outside of business hours, walked out with 200 grand in cash, and to my knowledge has never been caught. It's been happening. Theft it remains the biggest challenge. It's increased over the last couple of years. Especially in Washington, where we have a lot of business, theft with the use of firearms has really increased, and that opens up a whole nother area of liability as well. So that really remains, in my opinion, the biggest risk, especially for a dispensary. Physical security remains very, very important to protecting these locations, and you'd be surprised that a lot of these locations don't have very much physical security in some states.
So kind of bringing it back to Symphony Risk, it's a diverse offering. One of those are risk management.
Absolutely.
Right? Risk management may be synonymous with loss control. Do you have any just high level tips or thoughts on how dispensaries, how cannabis operators can protect themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we view risk management as hand in hand with insurance, obviously, especially for a cannabis business. Insurance is very limited. It's very narrow. It's never going to cover all your exposures or, frankly, even come close in a lot of cases. And that's where risk management becomes all the more important. So we do a lot of work, visiting locations, talking about their physical security. We've done a really good job kind of analyzing all the programs for property out there and tracking what exactly do they require in terms of, it gets as detailed into weight of your safe. Is it bolted into the ground? Do you have 2 cameras with facial surveillance on all entries? It can really, really get detailed. And like I mentioned earlier, these applications become warranted on the policy. So if you're not in compliance with one of those things, a claim is not going to get paid. So we don't view risk management as sort of, a bonus throw-in. It's core to what we do because insurance is never going to cover anything. And the other side of that is insurance premiums in cannabis are astronomically high compared to other businesses. So we're able to provide that risk management. We're able to give a little bit of that back and really, take everything A to Z for a client instead of, just being there for a renewal and collecting a check.
So we talked about D&O that falls within the professional liability portfolio. We didn't talk about bud tenders liability. I mean, is that still, and for those that are not familiar with bud tender liability, a consumer goes into a dispensary and they're asking questions about what a particular strain, how that's going to affect their emotional state, their physical state, is it psychoactive, et cetera. And the bud tender is presumably giving them advice on a particular product. Does that fall into a gray area? Is that maybe not medical advice, but that's certainly into the realm of professional advice? I mean, are you seeing that as more of an issue, or carriers now offering some sort of solution for that? What do you think about that bud tender liability exposure?
I would say the forward-thinking carriers are contemplating that exposure. Given the landscape of cannabis, everything is limited. A lot of these programs don't contemplate things like that. We haven't seen a ton of activity in terms of claims to date. For most people, the worst case scenario of taking a cannabis product that doesn't agree with you is, you get very sleepy, maybe you go to bed, you don't feel great the next day. You typically don't see, serious bodily injury or property damage as associated with taking these things yet. I think that could change going forward, especially with some of the new products that are out there. Minor cannabinoids are a big one. They're a topic I'm very interested in. Essentially, maybe not everybody, but I think most people probably know THC is, the primary chemical in the cannabis plant that provides the psychoactive effects. But there are 100, 200 plus additional compounds that are in the plant. Many of them don't occur in more than a very small percentage naturally. And we've now taken those and created extracts out of those. So it's essentially pure delta 8 THC or delta 10 THC or other compounds that simply do not occur naturally in the plant to that to those levels. And I think that is where we may start to see some BI claims. That's where we don't necessarily have the informal thousands of years history of people using cannabis, and it does become something new to some extent. So I think that's where bud tenders liability could come into play. Who recommended the product? Of course, the dispensary, the producer of the product. I think when we start to see, if we do start to see those types of claims, everybody in the supply chain is going to be named and called in.
So you touched on a particular product line, Delta 8. I'm not sure if the room is familiar with Delta 8. It has been in the news in recent past and actually fairly recently. You might have seen Delta 8 as an advertisement. You could pick it up at a convenience store, a gas station. So it's not subject to any FDA regulation. Frankly, it's not subject to any regulation. Can you talk about Delta 8 a little bit and some of the concerns surrounding it?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to back up for a second. So we've been talking about cannabis today, and I tend to think of hemp as part of the same umbrella there. The key difference is that hemp was legalized by the federal government in 2018 under the Farm Bill. Hemp is just cannabis, but it's been arbitrarily defined as having less than a certain threshold of delta 9 THC. So as long as you take a hemp plant that conforms with that definition, anything you extract from it is considered hemp. It can be psychoactive, it's still considered hemp, it's not subject to state regulation, and unless there's a specific state law, which some states have implemented, it's legal in all 50 states. I think that's where we're now in kind of a dangerous situation where we have a new cannabinoid being sold in kind of an unregulated market by people who don't really know anything about it. We don't really know what the dosages are. We don't know who's getting their hands on it. And I think that's sort of the recipe for disaster that's a little bit different than the highly regulated and controlled THC dispensary model. Especially in Illinois is one of the most controlled states if you've ever been to a dispensary here. So Delta 8 and really Delta 8 is just one of the hemp derivatives that we're seeing very commonly now. It has gotten very popular, especially in states that don't have a legal cannabis program. And I think we may start to see more and more claims and potentially more enforcement in that area of the market.
So then, it kind of brings me back to industry standardization, and I'll do a quick plug for AAIS. The position that we've taken, we've developed two distinct product lines, and we've taken the position that we are not going to address the cannabis market through endorsements, but rather standing up proper product lines, just like a general liability, just like a business owner's. What do you see as some of the challenges with so few standard market participants? And there is absolutely a place for excess and surplus lines carriers. This isn't any sort of derogatory knock on excess and surplus, but what are the challenges with the market operating outside of the departments of insurance? What are you seeing from carrier to policy to policy?
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge challenge. Outcomes are very unpredictable. You could have two what you think are very similar risks, and the same carrier, likes one and doesn't like the other, and can attach whatever endorsements and exclusions they want. You often don't get to see that until the 11th hour, depending on how early did the opportunity come to you and all of that. It's very, very challenging. And I think what that's resulted in is cannabis operators and the buyers of this insurance they frankly don't know what this covers and what it doesn't for the most part. Every policy is so different. Some take the approach of kind of a standard ISO base form with 100 endorsements attached to it. Others, modify the ISO forms and kind of sneak their own language in. And you really, really have to, be reading these things front to back. And, they're 170 pages each, so it's not fun. But it is very, very difficult to predict what's going to be covered and what isn't if, you don't have an intimate understanding of the program and have seen it pay claims before. So it can make it really, really difficult to compete, especially if it's a price buyer. You can point out all day the exclusions in some of the lower cost programs, and a lot of times they don't care because other programs haven't paid their claims. So I think the lack of standardization means that the industry has been very, very unhappy with insurance overall. They view it as a huge pain point and a huge challenge, and not something that's helped them a ton. Unfortunately, I think a big part of that has just been lack of expertise among brokers around the cannabis business. But I understand where they're coming from, and as things mature, that's what I'm looking forward to the most is more apples to apples programs that are out there, more transparency in what's going to be covered and what isn't. A lot of times you even ask an underwriter, does this vault room comply with your requirements? And they'll just send you the endorsement and say, you read it and you make the decision. Which, I can't imagine who'd be comfortable with that.
And certainly standardization is important, but it still allows carriers to create their own proprietary language, their proprietary, pricing, endorsements. But, we've reviewed a lot of the policies. And sometimes products isn't included, and it's really just a prem-ups program. But you talk about the broker distribution channel. Sometimes they're just happy to get a quote for their client.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's kind of an unfortunate situation, because if states were taking a harder look, and I think they are now, it's such the tax revenue derived from the cannabis market is becoming so significant, you really can't turn a blind eye to it. So I do see, and we're working with a lot of departments of insurance who are really excited to see us file a product line, whether it's Cannabop or Cannability, because they want to encourage standard market participation. They want to protect the operators, that the tax base, amongst other things. But so yeah, I think that's a really important point. One of the last points I'll bring up. I also think there's this perception that there's the black market. There's a lot of bad actors. Do you still think that's the case, or has that started to thin out? What's your perspective?
Yeah. The black market is still alive and strong in the U.S. and cannabis and worldwide. Probably equal, if not a little bit larger in size to the legal market now. I think last I checked, legal sales were around 30 billion. I think the total market is probably somewhere around 70 or 80. What I would say, what I think has changed is that the sort of, the gray market or traditional market actors is, what they like to call themselves. I think they've sort of separated a little bit where, 5 years ago, I think there was a concern with just about any licensed cannabis business that, there may be some funny business going on the side. There may be some cannabis going out the back door to a different state, whatever it may be. I think that's changed a lot in that sophistication and has come to a lot of these businesses, and they've sort of segmented into totally above board, licensed, compliant, very professional businesses, and then actors who kind of remain in that gray market space, and certain states more than others. I mean, California, Oregon, Washington, still a huge kind of traditional gray market there. Illinois, very, very little. It's highly regulated and controlled. Very few cultivators, obviously, in Illinois, given our weather. So I think that has changed a bit, and that it's easier to kind of identify the established businesses that are doing things above board versus, sort of the remaining businesses that are still doing things in a little bit more of what they would call a traditional way.
Do you think surplus has anything to do with that? I want to say it was Oregon, had so much surplus. It was like if you gave every man, woman, and child in the state like a pound of marijuana, you'd still be left with with some astronomical amount of surplus. I mean, is that still an issue? And is there a way to somehow rein that in?
Yeah, it's definitely still an issue. I do think that is what drives a lot of black market trade is excess supply that especially in a state like California, for example, you can't profitably sell with the taxes. So then do you lose your business or start thinking about doing something illegal? And I think a lot of people who have especially operated in this business before it was ever legal, that's not a big jump for them. So I think it is. I think supply is a big issue, and I think that's why we see new states really making a point to control the supply. New Jersey, Illinois is a great example. Well, for different reasons, I guess. But 3 years later, we still only have 16 licensed cultivators. Oklahoma is the opposite. Anybody can get a license with $1,000. So I think we are seeing basically every state that's coming online on the East Coast, especially, is really limiting the number of cultivators and the supply because I think they really want to avoid that pitfall.
Do you think that's what ultimately has put the kind of the hold in New York on the issuance of new licenses? So everything cannabis related is really kind of taken a pause. They jumped really headfirst into the market, putting some rules and regulations, public consumption, et cetera. Do you think maybe they're rethinking that, and that's potentially why they want to maybe pause, reset, and then tighten some of those restrictions up?
Yeah, I would think that's a big part of it. Obviously, when you announce that you're becoming a legal state and you have a certain number of licenses, there are going to be a lot of people who want to increase that number so that they have a chance to get a license. So, how a state ultimately decides the final number, against the pressure of other groups, wanting more licenses, maybe existing operators wanting fewer. I think that's, it's a huge, it's really, I think it's the biggest thing that shapes what the marketplace is going to look like in that state. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine, especially in states like New York, Illinois is one too, where social equity is a big goal of issuing cannabis licenses. I think that's going to be a big part of it, is deciding exactly how many we're going to issue, with the idea of keeping supply at a reasonable level, while also allowing as many people to participate as possible. And I don't think that's an easy. Colorado has done a good job at that. Very few states have, I think. So it's very difficult nut to crack.
Yeah. So with that, if there's any questions, thoughts, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the development of other products beyond cannabis, like psilocybin and things like that. What's happening with those products or those substances in terms of the risk that we're talking about?
Sure. Well, we get asked about it all the time. It's, I guess, considered an adjacent industry. We're really in the early days. It's difficult to say how things like psilocybin are going to shape up. I think Oregon is probably the most progressed so far. I believe the state is actually going to license cultivators of these mushrooms. I believe you can only consume them within like a clinical setting. So frankly, I have no idea what that insurance is going to look like. I would imagine much closer to sort of a medical treatment versus the more informal cannabis dispensary process. Cannabis it's recommended by a doctor if you're a medical patient, but it's not prescribed. It's not a prescription drug, and it's really not administered or controlled with the same with the same strictness as psilocybin is going to be in states that are considering it. Other states with psilocybin have moved to decriminalize it. That doesn't necessarily create an insurable industry, so I think it'll kind of remains to be seen how that'll look. But it's interesting. There's obviously a huge interest in these products, and more so in the last several years, and that's not going to stop. So we're keeping our eye on it, and it's interesting. But I do think it's going to be more of a similar to a clinic or a hospital type coverage than a dispensary coverage.
Yeah, that's you hit it. It's the clinics. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a differentiation between, or at least in the beginning, the way that cannabis and marijuana are sold and distributed, as opposed to a clinical setting where the distributors are going to be licensed and will have to undergo whatever courses. But there has been a lot of inquiries into how this is going to be insured, who's going to insure it, because it will be, at least in Oregon, proper medical, mm-hmm. office settings, and I do believe you have to consume on site, but I could be wrong. But then again, for sure professional, right?
Yep,
for sure
absolutely.
Professional liability. But yeah, the decriminalization does not create an insurable.
The midterms coming up, a lot of focus on the congressional elections, and that's interesting. But the states, a lot of movement in the states as well. And there's winds that may change the dynamic in some of the states that are teed up and ready to go, or does that put the pedal down on some states and some on what the outcomes might be with the legalization of the states?
I haven't looked too much into the up and coming states that may or may not legalize during the midterms. We're frankly swamped with Vermont, New Jersey, New York. I would certainly expect an additional handful of states to legalize it. The dominoes are falling. I think they all recognize the tax revenue, and especially moving kind of out east. When every state is a hop and a skip away, they're seeing that they need to be a part of it too, or their population is just going to drive 30 minutes to the next state over. So I would certainly expect another handful of states to legalize, and we're seeing more states considering just jumping right to recreational, which is interesting.
It's hard to argue that going back to the tax revenue on cannabis. So some of the states that maybe are more traditionally conservative, it's a significant amount of revenue.
Yeah, and seeing action in traditionally much more conservative states like mm-hmm. Mississippi and Arkansas, and the momentum has already started. It's only a matter of time until it spreads 50 statewide, I think. So. But federal may be, another 5 years out. We'll see. Yeah.
Do you see the ability to conduct studies opening up a little more now than it has been in the past? Because of more states, like the domino effect that we talked about?
Sure.
Or because of other products like psilocybin products? Do you see that might open up more and why?
Yeah, so great question, actually. We were going to touch on that earlier, so thank you for that. The biggest challenge there is cannabis is still a Schedule I controlled substance at the federal level. And what that means is the federal government does not recognize any potential for medical benefit, and therefore it cannot really be studied clinically in any sort of robust way. That has changed a little bit. Previously, I think it was the University of Mississippi was the only university that could actually grow cannabis for this study, and I think they grew like 1% THC, which, if you go to the dispensary, that's not representative of the products that are out there today. I believe the federal government has issued permits for an additional 6 universities. I think Penn State is one of them. I can't remember the other 5, who are now going to begin, growing and presumably providing this cannabis for study. But until it's removed from Schedule 1 of the CSA, we're really not going to see any, robust, nationwide longitudinal studies. The hurdles to perform them are just too great at the moment.
But we were talking earlier, and I was asking, because it's obviously primarily property casualty insurers here, but you might underwrite workers' compensation. And obviously there's a huge opioid crisis in this country. And, the thought process is for an injured employee that might be prescribed an opioid, what if that was substituted for marijuana? And there are some early studies being done that it has a much more positive effect with expediting a return to work. You're not seeing that long-term addiction spiral. You're not going to get addicted to marijuana, but you certainly, if you're taking OxyContin, could yield some unfavorable health effects.
Yeah, and I think people very much see that and are desperate to try something new. And it can be frustrating to kind of see that hurdle at the federal level remain in place. In spite of things like, for example, the government owning a patent on the effectiveness of cannabinoids as neuroprotectants. So owning a patent for that would seem to indicate that you do see some potential medical benefit, but it can be very frustrating because we frankly don't know the long-term effects of a lot of this stuff. We have the informal thousands of years of history, but we don't have rigid scientific studies, and I think we really need them.
Great question.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe.
Great.
Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it.